I know that I am not particularly predisposed towards metaphysical questions because I don't think they can really be answered. So the idea of what started the universe, we can't really answer that. I think that to say God, that's just a placeholder for ignorance.
Right.
That doesn't help. You know, because
I may have to get you in here with Prager
I'd love
to discuss it. Yeah,
you
well,
get infinite regress.
Yeah.
You know, so where did God come from? It's just putting off that moment of ignorance a little bit further.
Hey, I'm Dave Rubin, and unless I've been impeached by a completely partisan vote, this is still the Rubin Report. As always, a quick reminder to click the subscribe bell so you guys have a small chance of seeing our videos right here on the YouTube. And more importantly, joining me today is an author, political commentator, and fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Heather McDonald. Welcome back to the Rubin Report.
It's such an honor, Dave. Thank you so much for having me on.
I'm glad to have you back. Had you on about a year ago,
Yeah.
and the people, they love you. That's what I learned.
God.
That's what I learned in the YouTube comment section.
It's just the aura being in your presence.
Yeah.
You know, there's so much love coming at you that a little spills over.
All right, well, you're killing it in the scarf game today, so I feel like I have to be very sharp.
Oh, thank you. It's not too brilliant.
So here we go. So one of the things I wanted to start with here is something that we discussed briefly for about 5 or 10 minutes in our last interview. You are a secular conservative. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of conservatives seem to think that that is either an oxymoron or just simply cannot exist because conservatism has to have some sort of religious underpinning. So I thought that would just be an interesting place for us to pick up the conversation.
I base my conservatism on empirical truth, on what I've observed in life. I can talk about the necessity of the two-parent family because we can see empirically what happens when the marriage norm breaks down in communities. I support most traditional values because I think we have a history of stability when those are honored. I don't think it's particularly stable to rest a set of political principles or moral principles on the basis of revealed wisdom, that this holy book supports this. And I'll notice this, people who I respect enormously, Dave, whether it's Dennis Prager or Michael Medved, that are making the argument that you cannot have a moral society without a foundation of religious belief, I would ask them, these are two brilliant Jewish thinkers, why don't you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? It's revealed truth. The New Testament says that this is gospel. They don't believe that.
So basically, if you're going that far with religion and you're saying you need this revealed truth, this belief to organize a society, why not the next level of the revealed truth or whatever the next level is or something like that?
Right. They will not take it as simply necessary truth, the fact that the New Testament claims to be the Word of God. Why don't they believe that? They're basing their same belief in the Old Testament on the same claim that the New Testament makes. They just choose to be agnostic or atheistic about one of those holy books. I could apply the same challenge to their belief that the Old Testament is the revealed truth because it's simply self-validating. So I would look for a different set of principles that does not depend on one's suspension of disbelief and an acceptance that something is revealed truth for my moral code.
So with that being said, does it matter to you if the end result is the same, right? So I'm going to guess that on most of the important issues of the day, you probably agree in large part with both Dennis and Michael Medved, and most conservative thinkers that maybe come from a more religious background. So at the end of the day, when it all washes away, do you think it really matters? Do you think that's sort of a long-term problem?
No, I guess if we arrive at the same place, I think it's a problem for that segment of voters or thinkers who don't find those appeals particularly interesting. But I'll be very honest, Dave. Part of my resistance to this is simply I don't find claims of petitionary prayer and the idea of a personal loving God consistent with what I see, what I call the daily massacre of the innocents. To me, it's a very hard claim to make that I should expect God to pay attention to my well-being when he's willing to allow horrific things to happen to people far more deserving and innocent than I am. So for me, it's partly just a truth value. I cannot stomach what appears to me to be a patently false claim about a personal loving God.
It's interesting. I've mentioned that I've had John Kasich in here, who's the former governor of Ohio and presidential candidate, obviously. And when I asked him about faith, he said something that sounded sort of almost flippant, but I thought it was really actually pretty insightful. He said, some people can do it with God, I just can't. And I thought that was actually like, for a certain set of people, where you're able to sort of always sort of maybe go back to your intellectual side. Some people just sort of get tired of that. Does that make sense? Well,
I also think I think it's genetic. I know that I am not particularly predisposed towards metaphysical questions because I don't think they can really be answered. So the idea of what started the universe, we can't really answer that. I think that to say God, that's just a placeholder for ignorance.
Right.
That doesn't help. Because
I may have to get you in here with Prager to discuss it. Yeah,
you get infinite regress. So where did God come from? It's just putting off that moment of ignorance a little bit further. So I don't find those questions particularly relevant. On the other hand, I recognize that for much of humanity, that is a very deep need to ask these basic questions about origin and endpoint. Where are we all headed? What is the meaning of life? To me, anybody who claims that he doesn't find meaning in life when there is Mozart and Haydn, to invoke a Dennis Prager favorite, or Beethoven or John Milton or Aeschylus or Anthony Trollope,
or just waking up with purpose
for
whatever you do.
Trying to do the best you can do. I don't find life meaningless for 1 second.
Yeah. So does it worry you then when Republicans or more broadly conservatives talk about God all the time? Or now that we're seeing sort of a huge fracture in what's happening with the left, they're like completely afraid to even mention God or anything like that. Bernie, I think, is basically an atheist, although he won't really say it because I think there would be political repercussions. Right. But are you, does that make you sort of feel not totally at home with the conservatives?
Well, I grew up in a very secular environment, and so it was a novel discovery to me in the 90s when I was in a more conservative writing circle, and I grew up as a default liberal. I hadn't been exposed to religion. I mean, it is an amazing thing. I had been educated on the coasts, and I didn't realize how different they were. So in one sense, I'm very parochial. And I hadn't been exposed to the degree of religious faith. I guess I find it, I'm always amazed what to me seems parochialism when I hear, especially Christians in a political environment, getting up there and talking about Jesus as God. My view immediately is, well, there are Jews around, at the very least, and there are Muslims.
Yeah.
How can you be so confident that everybody in this audience is of that particular faith? And I also would notice simply that religion has been tamed by the Enlightenment. It has now been taught to mind its manners and sit quietly in the corner. We all, the great kissy-wissy between Jews and Christians that we all now talk about, the Judeo-Christian environment, heritage, and perhaps rightly so. That's a novel thing.
Right. It wasn't like that.
It wasn't
for a long
like
time.
that.
There were
for
things
a long
called
time.
the Crusades and a whole bunch of other stuff. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all these religious supporters are saying we cannot live without it. They are conveniently overlooking what the history of religion has been in our tradition and still is in many other places that have not gone through the Enlightenment. The concept of tolerance is not a religious concept. It's an Enlightenment concept. And religion in the West has been forced to accept tolerance, which is a very good thing. But that is not an idea that is inherent to religion.
Right. So I don't want to be Prager or Medved's
let's
lawyer at the
come
moment,
on.
but I think what they would say is that it was all the religious stuff that organized society that allowed us to get to the Enlightenment, so that the Enlightenment could then, unfurl all these good ideas.
Well, I don't think Christianity or Judeo-Christianity has any necessary monopoly on moral virtues. I think there's a certain core sense of, I don't know any culture that says murder is okay. But every culture starts to make certain distinctions. What?
They don't last that long.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's fun for a moment. You know, you get to give in to your most aggressive tendencies.
Right. Where do you think Trump falls out on this? Because I don't think anyone really thinks he's a religious person or perhaps even a believer in any real sense of it. Yet Christians or evangelicals especially really seem to like the job that he's doing.
Well, I don't think he has particular principles or deep thoughts about much of anything. I think he's a chameleon. He takes on the coloring of what is convenient at the time. So whether he believes or not, I don't know. I don't think he's thought much deeply about it either, and it doesn't really matter. But certainly he's willing to speak that rhetoric in order to get that vote.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.